Well, and since it is the magic hour, 2 o'clock Mountain Standard Time, depending where we are, let's go ahead and get started. And I'm assuming we'll have more people joining us. And we are also recording this and we are going to be posting it on our website as well so that we can have people who are interested in this topic learn more about it because it is such a germane topic right now. And so I'm going to start. I am Candace Anderson and I am currently the chair of the J. Reuben Clark Law Society's Women in Law Committee. And today we are privileged to have with us Professor Rana Lehr-Lenhardt, and she has an amazing background. Some of this I did not know, although I've known Rana for many years. She has an LL.M. with an emphasis in international human rights and comparative law from Columbia Law School, and she graduated as a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar and also received the Parker School Certificate in Foreign and Comparative Law. She did earn her Juris Doctorate from BYU's J. Reuben Clark Law School, and she graduated magna cum laude and was also inducted into the Order of the Coif. She is a teaching professor of law at the University of Missouri-Kansas City School of Law, and she's taught some amazing courses, including international human rights law, global legal systems and comparative law, international law, Spanish for lawyers, and multicultural lawyering. And I love film and human rights. So excited to have Rana here. And Rana, just take it away. Thank you so
All
much
right.
for doing this.
Yes, it's a pleasure. And I was with my human rights class, we do this collaborative online learning part of it with a university in Brazil. And in past years, we've done the focus has been on the sustainable development goals. And this year I said, you know what, let's do human rights in times of conflict because they're all around us. I mean, I guess they always have been, but it just seems more and more. All right. So, um, so first thing is, well, what are human rights? So, and normally I teach and we have a discussion about what human rights are. And it's interesting to hear what people think and say. And it's also interesting for Americans to kind of pause and think, well, what are human rights? We know what constitutional rights are. We can probably name civil and political rights, but when it comes to human rights, we're a little bit, we don't use that language quite as much. So human rights are those rights that are, I would say, inalienable to humans, that all humans have them regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, location, language, all of those kind of things. They can't be sold, they can't be taken away, they can't be denied. Of course, they can be violated, and that's what we're going to talk about today in part. I have a couple, I learn well through graphs. And by the way, if people have questions, I'm happy for people to raise a little hand emoji and interrupt, and I'm happy to discuss as we go along. And that's more my style anyway. So don't hesitate, because I know it's an odd forum in that it's webinars, it feels very lectury, but I'd love to have a discussion. I like to use graphs and such because it helps to take a bunch of data and show it to us a little bit easier. And so here we can see it's called the human rights score. And this is, and it looks like it's, can you guys, is it going off the side of the screen for you guys? It is for me. Yeah, a little bit.
A little bit off the sides for us, but we can still see the most of the globe.
Okay. Okay. Well, I guess that's good enough. So human rights score around the world, and you can see, if you look on the bottom, you can see that red is obviously like a hot zone. Blue is cool and peaceful, and Pacific meaning to pacify, to be peace loving, I guess, peace focused. We can see that the US is kind of in the middle. Like, it's not as fantastic as we might think. Canada is doing much better. You see Western Europe much better, and then you can see hot spots and things around the world. So I just wanted to show that. And this, it says indicates the degree to which governments protect and respect human rights. Okay, but now let me show you another graph, and this is why I think it's important to really understand what graphs and things are measuring. Why is this? Oh, I see. It's not going to go until I give my examples of human rights, because it said that it's looking at the human rights that the governments respect and promote and all of that. So examples of human rights, right? Right to life, right to nationality, right to protection against torture, right to protection against discrimination before the law, fair trial. So those all are civil and political rights, which we're very comfortable with in the United States. But what about a right to education? Not as a privilege, but as a right that the government is obligated to give freely to all individuals. And is that just K through 12, like in the US, or does that include higher education that should be accessible to all? What about the right to health care? So this is, so the right to education, right to healthcare, those are in one of the human rights treaties. But notice that in the US context, we're like, whoa, right to healthcare. Some people feel squeamish about that. They're like, a right? Well, I don't know if we'd call it a right. In the United States, we really give an emphasis, some might say an unfair emphasis on civil and political rights. Those are protected in the Constitution, but these other rights called second generation or economic, cultural, and social rights, such as the right to education, right to healthcare, right to employment, and such things, right to time off, right to vacation. Those aren't seen or talked about in the United States as rights. Right to a job, and I put animal rights in the US. Sometimes I think that almost is thought to be as a part of a human right. It's not. Animals are not humans, so we can talk about animal rights, but they're not human rights. So anyway, so now let's look at this next. I want to put environmental rights and stuff. Okay, so then this is the other one I think was 2017. This one is 2022. And this is measuring the extent to which people are free from government torture, political killings, forced labor, and that they have property rights, enjoy the right or the freedom of movement, religion, expression, and association. And you can't see the bottom of this. In this one, the dark blue that the US is like the best. And then goes down to the light green. So you can see that with this metric of what the is being measured, the US is like the top with others who are at the top, right? But notice that in this one, the reason for the difference is because it's only looking at basically civil and political rights, which the US does a pretty good job of respecting and promoting and all of that. But if we come back here, where it's measuring, it doesn't limit it to civil and political right, it includes the economic, cultural, and social rights, like the right to education, right to healthcare and such. The US goes from being the top to mid-level because it's measuring things that the US just doesn't recognize as rights and doesn't provide freely to all at the same level. All right. So I put this here. I'll send the PowerPoints out so that I put this link in here so that you can click around and the organization has different things that you can look at, maps of what they're measuring, and it's really fantastic. All right, so question, where are human rights found? Good question. I should say, where are the legal responsibilities of human rights found? But, well, international agreements. So we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by the way, which is a declaration, it's not a treaty, therefore it doesn't have the force of law. But we could get into that, but we won't. But then we do have the two treaties that come from, that are based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Cultural, and Social Rights. And those three documents together are known as the International Bill of Rights. So Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's more general. It was passed unanimously by the General Assembly of the United Nations on December 10th, 1948. So December 10th every year is Human Rights Day, but we don't even talk about that in the United States. Okay. And then those two treaties, civil and political rights and economic, cultural, and social rights, are based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But it doesn't stop there. We have other rights, other treaties. We have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Notice it's a declaration. Countries have not been willing to sign it, to promote it to a treaty. So there are different populations or groups of individuals that have faced different forms of discrimination in history, and therefore there are some, I call them subject-specific human rights treaties, or declarations. So rights of indigenous peoples, Convention Against Torture, that's a specific type of group of human rights that are being violated. But within subject specific, we have the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women, for example, the Convention to Eliminate Racial Discrimination, for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so different subject specific ones. But everything is based on the International Bill of Rights, all the subject specific ones, all of that. I also listed regional human rights treaties, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Banjul Charter, there's the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, everything, all of these other human rights treaties, all of them are based on the International Bill of Rights. And the reason we have sometimes regional ones is because at the regional level, there can be stronger enforcement mechanisms, such as in the EU. In the EU, all EU members are required to sign and be parties to the European Convention on Human Rights and to give jurisdiction to the European Court on Human Rights. And compliance is very strong with their regional human rights treaties. Not so much in other regions of the world, working on it. And they look at Europe as an example. All right. So there are 3 areas of law that protect human rights in times of conflict. I put war, but I should really put conflict. Well, I put war for a reason, and I'll explain why. So human rights law. So all those treaties we just saw, and that really focuses on individual responsibility. And these are rights that the individual holds that the government has an obligation to promote and protect. So the rights the individual holds against the government. If the rights are being limited, then it's up to the government to do something about it, okay? So human rights. Then humanitarian law. Humanitarian law was called the law of war. And it limits, well, the intent is to limit civilian casualties and to limit the destruction, I guess I would say, of a country. I'll put it that way. And then we have refugee law, right? So for those fleeing conflict, we have the Refugee Convention, for example. So we have refugee law also. I'm mostly going to talk about human rights and some with humanitarian law, but I really am trying to keep this to human rights, but there's some overlap with human rights and humanitarian law. All right, so human rights applies all the time. Humanitarian law only applies during war. Okay, so those are the difference. Humanitarian law cannot be limited. So the protections in humanitarian law cannot be limited. They've already taken into account, reciprocity and proportionality and things like that. Human rights, however, during times of war can be limited. And this is what's important. People think, oh, human rights are universal, but universal is not the same as limitless. So the human rights that cannot be derogated, and derogated simply means limited or changed or deprived even, mostly it's just limited. Those are fundamental human rights that can't be limited. So for example, no arbitrary arrest, no arbitrary detention, even if you're in the time of war, even if it's, you're being invaded, the government cannot arbitrarily pull people off the street and arrest them. There has to be, and detain them. There has to be a reason. Freedom of religion, thought, belief also can't be limited. Notice that it's freedom of religion, thought, belief. That is different from freedom to exercise, right? Because that can be limited, by the way. Non-discrimination before the law. So even if, so during World War II in the United States, when there was the Japanese internment, actually that was a violation of non-discrimination before the law, for example. All right. So with humanitarian law, it's based on the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and all the additional protocols. So when you hear Geneva Convention, they're generally talking about the treaties that establish the law of war. Geneva Conventions have been adopted by all countries, by the way, and even if countries haven't adopted the Geneva Conventions, it's recognized as customary international law. So it still applies even if you don't sign the treaties, for example. And some examples of what's in the Geneva Convention is You can't target civilians, you can't target schools, hospitals, you can't take hostages, you can't recruit child soldiers, things like that. And I already mentioned this, that there's no derogation, no limitation in humanitarian law. So this is common Article 3 in the Geneva Conventions. Every single Geneva Convention has this common Article 3. And what it says, it's a lot of language there, but I put it so that people can read it later. But what it basically says is that there are additional protections for non-combatants. So that means civilians, but it also means any non-combatant, meaning a soldier who is no longer fighting because the soldier's wounded. They have to be treated the same way, or a soldier who's put up a white flag. Okay. Or once the soldier has been taken and captured, right? They're no longer a combatant. So for civilians and non-combatants, and specifically it says non-combatants, so persons taking no active part in the hostilities, okay? So it says that in all circumstances, they shall be treated humanely, and that the following things are prohibited always, in every circumstance, always. So violence to life and person, in particular murder, mutilation, cruel and unusual or cruel treatment, and torture. And we'll talk about these different specific things later. So taking of hostages, outrages upon personal dignity, especially humiliating and degrading treatment. So things such as rape as a war crime would be included in that. The passing of sentences and carrying out of executions without previous judgment pronounced by regularly constituted court. Okay. And then this Article 75 of Protocol 1 is based on the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it basically says much of the same thing, but it does add here collective punishments. And if I think about it, I'll mention that later. So collective punishments means, well, for example, Israel in the past, and again, has punished the citizens of Gaza because of attacks by Hamas and stuff. So they've done a collective punishment by refusing or by cutting off electricity to Gaza. So that doesn't just affect the military in Gaza, the Hamas military, it also affects every single civilian. And so when the electricity is cut off, that means not just there's no electricity, it also means that there's normally no water, it means that there's no sanitation, it means you can't go to school, all these things, right? So, and that would be an example of collective punishment. All right. So I've tried to limit what I'm going to talk about. Really, I'm trying to limit to violations against children, because I thought, so there's an organization called Human Rights Watch, and I love what they said. They said, and I think I put it in a slide later, that we're not here to say whether or not a conflict is justified. We're here to ensure that the governments respect the human rights of the individuals, specifically of the civilians. And so I thought, I'm not concerned of whether people think that the parties in these examples that I'm going to use, that they're justified or not in the violence. Hopefully we can all agree that children, so I focus on children, should not suffer at the hands of the decisions of the adults. So I'm focusing on, I put 6 grave violations against children, and I kind of morphed and put some other kind of things in, but I'm going to make it all work together. So killing and maiming of children, recruitment or use of children as soldiers, sexual violence against children, abduction of children, attacks against schools and hospitals, and then denial of humanitarian access. And that goes to everybody, but especially children. And so I'll go through and we'll look at examples of these. So killing and maiming of children. So this can be because the parties are specifically bombing civilian areas, bombing neighborhoods, bombing, and which is, by the way, against the Geneva Conventions, the carpet bombings that were done during World War II. The Geneva Conventions came out of the mistakes, the errors, the atrocities of World War II. And so one of the things that they're addressing is, well, we shouldn't be bombing civilian areas. But we still see that that's happening, even though it's in violation of the Geneva Conventions. Let's see, right. So this happens right through targeting civilian areas, targeting hospitals, targeting schools, happens when military are on the ground and there's crossfire. Landmines, it's a huge thing that has killed and maimed so many children, where the military will, in order to like ensure that that nobody from one side goes to the other side, they will mine an entire area. And the problem is not just during the war, but even if there's a ceasefire or peace later, nobody goes and demines. So often these minefields are left, and then it ends up being, more often than not, children. They kick a ball over there, or they run after, and they, even though there are signs posted, they kind of forget. And children have been significant victims of landmines. Cluster munitions, where they're intended to spread as much damage as possible. House demolitions, of course, right? Suicide attacks, all these different kinds of things. So I have different stats. And the one thing I want to mention as a recognition with when I use stats and numbers, I really do try to look for the most recent numbers, and I really do try to find the number given by various sources so that it can be most accurate. When I can't, I do mention that this is the number from this agency or something, so that, you know, we recognize that maybe there's bias in there, or we recognize that, well, this is the number, but how many go unreported? So just so that you kind of are aware with numbers. So I put here, and this was the most recent I could find, between 2005 and 2020. And since then, we've had so much more conflict going on. More than 104,000 children were verified as killed or maimed in situations of armed conflict, with more than 2/3 of these verified since 2014. And then I have numbers that are since 2020, for example, with the in Gaza, 11,500 children have been killed, according to the Palestinian authorities. So I'm just recognizing that that number is an old number. So looking at different examples for the impact on children in Yemen. So there's been a civil war in Yemen that started, was it 2015 or 2014? Oh, I have 2015. So from 2015 to December 2022, so it's a bit old. I couldn't find anything newer. 11,000 children killed or maimed in Yemen since the war started. And the equivalent is about 4 children every day that are being killed in Yemen. By the way, Yemen's not a giant, it's not like a really populous, it's not a big country. And that's, I mean, just think of that impact. And then I also put under killing and maiming, and I have this later too, but under killing and maiming, so often we're just thinking of the things that happen right then, but what about the thousands of children that die from malnutrition or from diseases or illness, that if the infrastructure was there, and if the war wasn't happening and the infrastructure was there, that they could easily be treated. So I included here just the reality that 2.2 million Yemeni children are acutely malnourished. 1/4 of them are under the age of 5. Most are at risk of extreme cholera, measles, other things that could be prevented from vaccines. And then with starvation as part of the maiming and killing, I put the other number is those are acutely malnourished, but then, and that's including other things, but this is specific to children in care, I guess is what I would say. So 400,000 Yemeni children from acute malnourishment. And one of the issues is like, well, let's just send food. Let's send the medical supplies. And I think there's so many good people in the world who want to do that and who do that. But the food is not being delivered. Instead, the rebel forces are taking it because it has to come through the ports, has to go through government. Governments, on the one side, government is taking it. On the other side, if it gets there, the rebels are taking it. And instead of being given to the civilians, they keep it for themselves, for their troops. And that's one way to encourage children to join, or to encourage families to send their boys to fight, because then in response, they get food for their starving families. Also, the rebels and the government forces are selling it to enrich themselves. And then another issue too is that with the whole structure because of civil war, that there is a lack of employment. And if there's a lack of employment, then there's a lack of being able to even have money to pay for the food, even if the food is available. So so it's so certain ways so complicated. And the other way it's not. It's like, stop fighting, let's have peace, and let's, you know, hold hands and sing kumbaya and work together. But all right. So that's Yemen, and that's simply been going on so long, and the numbers, I think it's important to not forget about Yemen, and I think so often we do. So I made sure to include some examples that aren't in the news as much very more. I asked my daughter, I said, have you heard about this? Have you heard about that? She's like, no, I haven't. I've only heard about Gaza. So of course I put Gaza in, but I also wanted to include examples from other places because it saddens me that we quickly forget the suffering from areas that are no longer in the news, and we don't think about it again. So since October, and this number I got from just a few days ago, the Palestinian officials estimate that 11,500 children have been killed in Gaza. And that's one Palestinian child every 15 minutes. And then this didn't fit neatly with things, but I think it needs to be mentioned: psychological trauma. So we talk about the maiming, we talk about the killing, starvation, and I'll talk about some other things, but what about the psychological trauma that these children will carry with them the rest of their lives? And so this quote is from the executive director of UNICEF. UNICEF is the United Nations some international something children's fund. Can't remember actually what it all stands for. It says children in both Israel and the state of Palestine are experiencing terrible trauma, consequences of which could last a lifetime. And so we have UNICEF and other organizations providing psychological counseling and things, but the war, the trauma is continuing. All right, so recruitment of child soldiers. So a child soldier is defined as children below the age of 15, by the way. So that's not 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds. It's under the age of 15. So actually, so it's 14-year-old and younger. That's my son is 15. He could be like he could be given a gun and not called a child soldier. That is so disturbing to my brain. And the use of a child soldier is considered a war crime. It's against the Geneva Convention. It's considered a war crime also. And so I put in Yemen. So I found that nearly, since the civil war began in Yemen, nearly 4,000 boys have been recruited into the fighting. And I didn't add this, but they also found, and these aren't just like somebody made up the number. This is UNICEF actually being able to have a name with a number. So this isn't an estimate. It was actually 3,900 something, but I rounded because it was easier for me. But it also mentioned 90 girls who have been recruited to work at checkpoints. So they're not in the fighting, but they have guns and they're at the checkpoints. Yeah. Oh, I must have put something in the wrong place. I thought I had another one for child soldiers, but I might have a slide out of place. Okay. Sexual violence against children. All I can say is just so wrong. So this is a report from Children and Armed Conflict. In that report, it confirmed 749 confirmed cases of sexual violence against children in 2019 alone. And 98% of those were committed against girls. And this is one of those times when I want to say, okay, it's 749 confirmed cases. That's where they have an individual child and they talk to that child. And my thought is, and how many times does no one talk, because nobody's there to even ask the question, or if there is some, I think that's the biggest thing, nobody's even there to ask the question. And then what about the stigma associated with it, or what about the children that don't even have the words to describe what's going on? So this is one of the numbers where I'm very sad to say that I think it is severely under reported. And that's what the president of Save the Children said. Sexual violence is underreported at the best of times, but even more in conflict areas, especially among children. So with sexual violence, it's used for different reasons, but it's especially used as a weapon of war, and it's especially used to demoralize the opponents, whoever you're going against. It's used to terrorize and intimidate, and it's used to attack the psyche, really, of the other side. Because if you can't protect your children, then what are you here for? I listed the countries where children are at greatest risk of sexual violence in conflict, and that's Colombia, Iraq, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Not on this list simply because I think the list is a little bit older, and I have this in a later slide. Haiti is now has skyrocketing numbers of women and girls who are being raped, as not from, it's not a war, it's gang, I guess gang warfare, I would call it, and the government is unable or unwilling to protect the women and the girls, and so it's being used as a weapon to mark their territory, to terrorize and intimidate. So Haiti should also be on here. And then I just included, right, that this includes rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced sterilization, forced abortion, sexual mutilation, sexual abuse, sexual torture, and this is at the hands of armed groups, government forces, and law enforcement. And of course, there's the physical trauma, by the way, right? Because with boys and girls, I mean, first of all, it's violent. And second of all, it can result in lasting damage to the urinary tract, to their anal, to their anus, and if left untreated, it can cause horrible damage. And of course, then there's the psychological aspect of it. Okay, so this is Haiti, and I just wanted to mention this because Haiti just has, I just started seeing articles in the news about Haiti and about sexual violence just recently. So this is from 2023, a UN special procedures reported that armed gangs are using systemic sexual violence, including collective rape, so gang rape, mutilation as a means of exerting their territorial control under their control. So much of this is happening in the capital, Port-au-Prince, but it's the gangs are going and trying to control more and more area. So now you have internally displaced people trying to flee the violence, and the gangs following and terrorizing as it is. And this is a quote from Natalie, well, from it's an NGO in Port-au-Prince. Women and girls are faced with an inhuman social reality. In marginalized neighborhoods, they are exposed to physical and psychological violence. Beatings, intimidation, gang rape, murder are just some of the methods gangs use to establish their domination and force women and girls into total submission. And focusing on women and girls in part, I was reading an article that explained that it's women and girls who have had to take on the responsibility of providing, of working to be able to buy food, right, for their families. And I don't know if it's because the men are all fighting or are killed or what, but what happens is something that's very typical for the women and girls to do. They'll have to cross streets, they have to leave their houses to go and buy produce or different things, and they'll cook and sell that or sell the produce or whatever. And so it's as the women and girls are out trying to go to work, trying to provide for their families, that's when they're being targeted. And it's hard. They have to work, they have to make a living so they don't starve. And yet it's as soon as they leave the house that they're being targeted by these gangs. And then I put, in addition, I just thought it's important to recognize some of the other, or give voice to some of the other issues. So in addition to rape as a tool of violence and intimidation, humanitarian aid, right? And we saw the same thing when I talked about Yemen, that as there's conflict, whether it's a war between two nations, whether it is a civil war like in Yemen, or whether it's like in Haiti, where it's not necessarily a civil war, but you have all these gangs that I guess they don't want to take over the government because the government is inept as it is anyway, and they're just trying to take control of everything monetary and the land. But because of that, you don't have the production in society that you would normally have. So you have 5.2 million people in need of humanitarian aid, 5,400 victims of gang violence, including 3,000 murders and so much more. And as I said, the violence is spreading as the gangs are stronger and stronger. So abduction of children is another thing, and that goes along with, I should have actually probably put this with the child soldiers. So with the child soldiers, you have some like in Yemen where they're starving, everyone's starving, and so there's an incentive by the armed groups for the parents to give their boys kind of sell. I mean, they get money every month the boy's alive, I guess, for food for the family. But then there's also the abduction of children. So there can be abduction of the boys, by the way, to force them to be child soldiers. When it's abduction of the girls, they tend to be abducted by the fighters, and they tend to be sex slaves, is what it is. And they're forced to, I mean, they become pregnant, they are forced to become mothers, and it's obviously horrible. So there's that other thing. All right, so targeting hospitals, and then I'll talk about targeting schools and education. And I put targeting hospitals, of course, it affects more than just children, but it also affects children, right? In that if you don't have the hospitals, when children are sick, they can't go anywhere. You don't have doctors for vaccinations. You don't have any of this. There have been reports in the Ukraine, reports in Syria, reports in Gaza of women giving birth with no help from medical services, mothers and babies dying because of complications in childbirth and stuff. And so this tactic was used in Syria to attack hospitals and health facilities. And Russia used the same tactics in the Ukraine. And I put just recently, Israel targeted hospital in Gaza, claiming that it was housing Hamas fighters. Doctors denied this. And I saw a stat saying that of Gaza's 34 hospitals, 12 of them have been demolished or bombed. So they are demolished. Education. So this is a young girl in the Ukraine standing in what is left of her schoolhouse. So the Global Coalition to Protect Education from Attack put together 11,000 reports of attacks on education between 2015, 2019, including attacks on schoolhouses, on school buildings and all those kind of things. And then 22,000 students and teachers killed or recruited or raped or deprived of education wars. One of the tactics used by some, it's been used especially in Africa, or maybe we've just heard about it more in Africa, is that rebel forces, military people, well, I'll just say men with guns, will go to schools and take the children and force them to be a child soldier. So with targeting schools, in addition to not having a place for education, right? There's the loss of education. So I put here more than 2 million Yemeni children are out of school, and another 4 million are at risk of dropping out. In Sudan, war has begun again in Sudan rather recently again. So there's an estimated 19 million children out of school. They're still not back in school, by the way. So this was a couple months ago, and it had already been like 6 months. And so they're still not back in school. And so the UN officials said that it's one of the worst education crises in the world, probably because of number-wise, right? Troops, as I said, will take over schools, sometimes to put their munitions and stuff there, because according to the Geneva Convention, you can't bomb schools. But the exception is once the military starts putting their bombs or their munitions or whatever there, then it can be bombed. But what happens if it's being used as a school part of the time, and then they're storing their weapons there all of the time? Anyway, it gets really bad. So I just wanted to mention also that in addition to lack of education today, that affects these children for decades, if not for a generation, right? And then in addition to not having that education and putting them back in so many ways, that also puts them at danger, because when they're at school, they're kind of safe from being on the streets, or safe from, being picked up, or being sexually assaulted, or being killed in the street, or things like that. And so it puts them at risk of more violence, quite frankly, when the schools are closed. I also mentioned the Ukraine because that's still ongoing, with 900. There are more educational institutions destroyed now. This was what I had at the time. All right, how am I doing time-wise? Okay. Let's see. And then I also mentioned Gaza because it's in the news so much. But since early October, so that's only October, November, December. So 4 months. Says 221 schools have sustained damage from the attacks. And 40% of all schools, that's 40% of all schools in Gaza, have sustained attack, or have it damage, I guess I should say. So that means children aren't going to school. And then I thought of another, this I didn't mention specifically with my 6 grave violations of human rights, but movement is another human right, the freedom to move within your country. And I've mentioned internally displaced persons. So obviously when there is a war going on, you are limited on where you can live, on whether or not you can cross the street, whether or not it'll be safe to cross the street. And so I thought, that we don't talk about it quite as much, but the right for freedom of movement, which doesn't exist in times of war and conflict, or it's severely limited. So I already mentioned that Sudan, but it's not the country with the largest number of displaced people and the largest numbers of children who are displaced. And let's see, I have numbers down here. And this is, by the way, this is just the conflict again started in April 2023. So it hasn't even been a year. And this is the damage of, what is that, 10 months, 9 months of conflict. So displacement of approximately 6.1 million people within their country. And it's more than half of those displaced people, more than half of them are children. So when they're displaced, that also means, I think, psychological trauma. It also means lack of access to healthcare. Because when you're displaced, if you're lucky, you're in a refugee camp, but they don't have enough services. That also means lack of education with that displacement. And then I also wanted to mention the internally displaced Palestinians in Gaza. So there's an estimated 1.4 million internally displaced Palestinians. So internally displaced means within their country. So they're not refugees and they have no protections of refugees. A refugee is an individual who has left their country, who has crossed an international border. So that's a refugee. Internally displaced means you're a citizen of that country and you're still within the boundaries or the borders of that country, but not where you would normally live. You've had to flee from where you normally live. So it says more than half of the total population in Gaza are displaced. They're staying in shelters, hospitals, public buildings, on the street, host families. Because all the borders are closed, they can't get out. They can't go to Jordan. Well, in Gaza is next to Egypt. So the border with Egypt is closed, so they can't get there for any help. So shelters are, of course, overcrowded, lack of water, lack of food, lack of privacy, lack of health services. And again, which affects especially children and women. And then I mentioned denial of humanitarian aid. So again, there's the countries are sending aid to all of these places, some more than others, depends how much they're in the news. And we have a systemic denial of humanitarian aid that's being sent in. So I put examples of Turkey preventing humanitarian aid from reaching an area where it's a bit of a separatist area. And so the goal is to bring the civilians to their knees, that they're in so much pain and so many are dying, that they push against their leaders locally and submit to, in this case, to Turkey. And then I put similar things have happened, Syria, Venezuela, Yemen, where the government either refuses this humanitarian aid or even sometimes they'll refuse that they need the assistance. We don't need the assistance because for whatever reason, whoops, they are punishing. Why can I not move this? Punishing their civilians or the groups that are oppose them. So I just put this image. You can see, hopefully you can see that, but these are all UN vans and in the beginning. And then you can see after that, it's semi after semi after semi lined up to bring aid into Gaza. But Israel has closed the borders and is only letting in a few trucks. So far since October 31st, 217 trucks have been cleared for entry. Israel says, well, we can't just let any truck in. What if they have explosives? What if they have this? What if that? And so they say that they need to check every single one, even though they're coming from the United Nations, even though the United Nations has vouched for it. And the United Nations have said, well, only 217 trucks have been admitted since October 31st, but to meet the needs, the humanitarian needs, medical supplies, food, water, hygiene kits, things like that, they actually need 100 trucks a day to be allowed in. Oh, sorry, I'm totally in weird lighting at this point. Oh, is that better? That's bad. Well, sorry about that, guys. And then with humanitarian aid is water. I mean, we can only last, what, 3 days without water. And so this is, people lined up to get clean water, clean drinking water. And UNICEF has estimated that at least half of the water and sanitation facilities in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged, and that 70% of the people are drinking either salinized water, so salt water, or contaminated water. And so that's going to give rise, of course, to dysentery, all different types of illnesses that then they won't be able to treat because they don't have the medication necessary for that. In addition, missing vaccinations, right? So in these areas, this is in Yemen, but in these areas of conflict, the vaccinations aren't getting in. So you have all these children who aren't being vaccinated. And then you have deaths caused by very preventable diseases. Afghanistan is another one. And anyway, there are many. I put water also for Yemen. That's a huge thing. I mean, if you think about it, right? The Middle East, they don't have rivers flowing in their backyard. So in my backyard, I have a stream. I guess I could, get stuff and clean the water. It's fresh water, dirty, but fresh, right? I guess I could clean it. But there, they don't have that. And so in these areas where water is very limited, that's one of the things that opposing forces will attack because it's a quick way to bring people to their knees. Okay, doing okay. All right, so with humanitarian aid, and I've kind of mentioned this with Yemen, I wanted to mention Sudan too. So with the internal crisis, severe food and malnutrition. So we have 24.8 million people, almost half the population, facing severe food and malnutrition crisis. And even before the conflict, they were already in a precarious position because of economics, but also because of the prior wars that they were still getting over from, still recovering from. All right. So that's a lot. And I only focused really on, like I said, just a few things. I didn't get to the big things, didn't get to so many issues. But I mean, even just that, and just using a couple examples that are current issues, we can see that human rights are, even in the best of times, I would say, human rights are violated or at least not respected in so many countries. And then, of course, in times of conflict, those human rights are not just not respected, but violated, and often intentionally violated in order to create the most amount of suffering to the masses, so that the masses either comply or, you know, give up or change allegiance or whatever it is that needs to be done. I wanted to, instead of ending on that, I wanted to end on maybe I put some of the organizations that work in time or in areas of conflict. And I hope that you take the time to not just read the news accounts, but to go to these different organizations. You can just put in issues that you're interested in, or countries, and I'm sure you can find a lot. And I just mentioned two big ones. So I mentioned human rights in the beginning and humanitarian law. And for organizations that address all of these issues that I just talked about, there are two types of organizations. We often hear about the humanitarian organizations, right? Those are the ones that are bringing food, water, Doctors Without Borders would be part of that, medications, all of that. So we have humanitarian organizations that focus on getting all of these things to ensure that individuals can at least stay alive, right? So food, water, shelter, clothing, those types of things. It's the really physical things that people need. And so I put this organization, the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC, is a humanitarian organization. And I just took this from its website. It responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises, helps to restore health, safety, education, economic well-being, and power to people devastated by conflict and disaster. It was founded in 1933 at the call of Albert Einstein, and the IRC works in more than 50 countries and in 28 US cities, helping people to survive, reclaim control of their future, and strengthen their communities. It's a great resource because they give they explain what's happening in different conflict areas. And everything is a conflict area, right? That's their whole purpose, is to address humanitarian issues in conflict areas. So I put their website there. I put it there because they do great work, and I would say also unbiased, by the way. So, and then I also mentioned human rights. So then we have human rights organizations that are also active in areas of conflict. And I mentioned, and I put, well, I guess I'll say this first. So human rights organizations focus on the law of human rights. Boy, but the lighting is really bad. Is it better if I do this? So the law, and they're focused on researching and finding out if there are violations, and then holding the governments accountable. That's really what they're doing. And so Human Rights Watch is one of my favorite human rights organizations. They're across the world. They do amazing work, amazing reports, and they investigate international armed conflicts and then also civil wars. Then they report on those, on the violations of human rights, violations of the laws of war, and then they work to protect civilians here by pushing the governments to comply with their international obligations for human rights and humanitarian law. And I put their website, and that's just explaining their role in conflict and crisis. But so Human Rights Watch researchers will go into the countries, and they will they'll interview individuals, they'll document the violations of human rights. So they are the ones, when it says 759 confirmed cases, it's generally human rights organizations who have done that research. And when I say confirmed, that's what I mean. Like, they've been there and they talked with the individuals, and they can name the names and everything. And then they take this, they analyze the evidence, and then they will say, these parties are violating this human right and that human right, and this one's in these treaties that they've signed. And here's the evidence to support it. And in order to come into compliance, they need to change, and they need to do this, this, and this. So they're really about ensuring that the governments comply with their international obligations to promote and protect human rights, and to comply with the law of war. So that's the difference between the two. And then I thought we should put something from the UN. So this is from the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so part of what they do, a big part of what they do, is to prevent human rights violations in conflict areas. Whereas Human Rights Watch will be there during the conflict and it's documenting violations, the UN Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights attempts to prevent the violations from happening. They're there also to monitor, but because they're there to monitor and they say UN and they have, they're hoping that even their presence there will be enough to encourage governments to comply with human rights obligations. Okay, and I put their website there too. And then I just wanted to list, so, and I did this earlier, I just wanted to have this at the end, that all of these human rights can be found in these documents. Any of these names you can take, you can copy and paste it into your web browser and it will pull up the full treaty. They're easy to read and understand. It gives not just the rights, but also the government obligations under them. You can click around depending on where you go, and you can see which countries have signed, which countries have ratified, which countries have done this or that. And as part of each of these treaties was drafted and signed under the umbrella of the United Nations. And you can find reports from the oversight committee. There's a committee that goes with each of these, and governments have an obligation to report on their progress. And the committees will give a report back saying, by the way, you're violating certain things. And of course, we point our fingers around the world, but the United States has had the committee come and say, by the way, you are violating your treaty obligations because there's discrimination in your policing practices, for example. There's a big committee report on that and stuff. So I encourage each of you to read the news. I always tell my students, read the news so that you know what's going on in the world. And then go beyond the news and go to some of the human rights or humanitarian law websites to learn more, because they're going to give a different umbrella and a different lens. And then go to the treaty so that you know what's expected. So then when you're upset about things, you understand what the government obligations are, and you understand what the limits are in the international community for compliance. Any questions? All right.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
It really
Excellent.
was. Rana, thank you. I've learned so much. I thought I knew a lot, and I now am leaving so much more. And we will make your PowerPoint accessible too on the website. And if you want to go back and make sure, I know you were concerned there was one slide that made go ahead. It looked great to the rest of us if you hadn't said anything. But no, thank you so much. And we will, of course, have the recording of this also available.
That sounds great. It was a pleasure. I'm so glad that a few people were interested, and I hope that people watch it on the website, because I just think to have a knowledge of what's expected by our government and governments around the world really helps us to ask for accountability and ask for compliance. I mean, I don't think that's too much to ask for, accountability and compliance from governments.
I don't either. Thank you all so much for being here on behalf of the Women in the Law.